The sound of gunshots shattered the calm morning air as Pearl Scott dove for cover behind an overturned wagon, her heart pounding in her chest like a drum. She hadn't expected her journey west to turn into a nightmare, but the stagecoach robbery had changed everything in an instant. It was 1878 in the unforgiving territory of Arizona, and Pearl had come west to start a new life. At 23, she had left behind the comforts of Boston society after the passing of her parents, determined to make her own way in the world. Her uncle's invitation to join him at his ranch outside Tucson had seemed like the perfect opportunity. Now, as bullets splintered the wood near her head, she wondered if she'd made a terrible mistake. Stay down. A deep voice commanded as a man in a dust-covered duster slid into position beside her, revolver drawn. Pearl's frightened eyes met the steady gaze of a stranger whose face was partially hidden beneath the shadow of his wide-brimmed hat. He couldn't have been more than 30, with sun-weathered skin and eyes as blue as the Arizona sky. "Ethan Forrester, madam," he introduced himself quickly, taking a moment to tip his hat despite the chaos. "I'd say it's a pleasure, but the circumstances are less than ideal." Another volley of shots rang out, and Ethan returned fire with precision that spoke of years of practice. Pearl winced at each explosion from his gun. "There's 3 of them," he explained, quickly reloading. "They've already killed the driver and the guard." Pearl's blood ran cold. She had been dozing when the attack began, only to be jolted awake by the commotion and practically dragged from the coach by this stranger. "We need to move," Ethan said, scanning the rocky terrain. "They'll be circling around soon." "The other passengers," Pearl began, thinking of the elderly couple who had been traveling with her. "Already fled toward those rocks," he assured her, nodding to the distance where Pearl could just make out 2 figures huddled behind a boulder. "I came back for you when I realized you were still inside." A bullet ricocheted off the metal frame of the wagon, causing Pearl to flinch. "Ready to run?" Ethan asked, his expression serious. Pearl nodded, gathering her skirts in one hand. "Ready. Now." They burst from behind the wagon, Ethan providing cover fire as they raced toward a cluster of rocks about 50 yards away. Pearl's lungs burned as she ran, her boots kicking up dust. They were nearly there when she felt a searing pain tear through her side. She stumbled, a small cry escaping her lips. Ethan caught her before she hit the ground, sweeping her into his arms without breaking stride. He carried her the remaining distance, setting her down gently behind the rocky outcropping. "You're hit," he said, his voice tight as he examined the spreading crimson stain on her dress. Pearl looked down in shock. "I didn't think." The world began to swim before her eyes, the blue sky and red rocks blurring together. "Stay with me," Ethan urged, his voice seeming to come from very far away. "Pearl, Miss Scott," but the darkness was closing in, and the last thing Pearl saw was the worried face of the cowboy as he tore a strip of fabric from his own shirt to press against her wound. When Pearl next became aware of her surroundings, she was being jostled gently. Opening her eyes, she found herself on a horse, held securely against a firm chest. Ethan had one arm wrapped around her waist, the other holding the reins. "Welcome back," he said, relief evident in his voice when he noticed her stirring. "Thought I'd lost you for a minute there." Pearl tried to speak, but her throat was parched. The pain in her side had dulled to a persistent throb. "Don't try to talk," Ethan advised. "You lost a fair amount of blood. We're headed to my cabin. It's the closest safe place." Pearl wanted to ask about the other passengers, about the bandits, about a dozen other things, but exhaustion pulled her under once again. The next time she woke, she was lying on a narrow bed in an unfamiliar room. A lantern cast a warm glow over rough-hewn walls. She tried to sit up, only to gasp as pain lanced through her side. "Easy now," came Ethan's voice from nearby. She turned her head to see him rising from a wooden chair he'd placed beside her bed. "That bullet took a chunk out of your side. You're lucky it didn't hit anything vital." Pearl noticed he'd changed his bloodied shirt for a clean one, though his face was still streaked with trail dust. He looked exhausted, with dark circles under his eyes, but his movements were gentle as he helped her take a sip of water from a tin cup. "How long have I been here?" she asked, her voice hoarse. 3 days, Ethan replied, setting the cup aside. You've been in and out, mostly out. Fever took hold for a while, Pearl's eyes widened. 3 days, and you've been right here, he confirmed with a small nod toward the chair. Couldn't very well leave you alone, could I? The realization that this stranger had watched over her, cared for her while she was helpless, brought a flush to Pearl's cheeks. I don't know how to thank you, Mr. Forrester. Ethan, he corrected her, and no thanks necessary, anyone would have done the same, but Pearl knew that wasn't true. Not everyone would have risked their life to save a stranger, then devoted days to ensuring her survival. The others from the stagecoach, she asked, remembering the elderly couple. Safe, he assured her. After I got you settled, I rode out and found them. A passing wagon took them on to Tucson. Why didn't you send me with them? Pearl questioned. Ethan's expression grew serious. You weren't fit to travel that far, moving you could have reopened the wound. He stood and moved to the small stove in the corner of the cabin, stirring something in a pot that smelled surprisingly appetizing. You need to eat something, build your strength back up. As he brought her a bowl of stew, Pearl noticed the cabin for the first time. It was small but meticulously maintained, with a bed, table, 2 chairs, and a small bookshelf filled with well-worn volumes. A rifle stood propped in one corner, and a saddle rested on a stand near the door. It was clearly a bachelor's dwelling, but there were unexpected touches: dried wildflowers in a tin can on the table, a colorful woven blanket at the foot of the bed. Is this your home? She asked as he helped her sit up, propping pillows behind her back. One of them, Ethan replied cryptically. I range cattle for the Diamond K Ranch about 10 miles from here. Keep this place for when I'm working this section of the range. Pearl took a tentative spoonful of stew. It was simple but hearty, with chunks of venison and wild onions. This is good, she said with genuine surprise. A ghost of a smile crossed Ethan's face. Man can't survive on hardtack and coffee alone out here, had to learn to cook or starve. As Pearl ate, Ethan explained what had happened after she'd been shot. The bandits had eventually given up and ridden off when they realized the passengers had scattered and help might be coming. He'd gotten her on his horse and brought her straight to the cabin, cleaned and bandaged her wound, and sent word to the ranch that he'd be staying at the line cabin for a while. I wrote to your uncle too, Ethan added. Figured he'd be worried when you didn't arrive. Found the address in your things, hope you don't mind. Pearl shook her head. Thank you, that was thoughtful. He'll likely come for you once you're well enough to travel, Ethan said, a strange note in his voice that Pearl couldn't quite identify. Was it disappointment? How do you know my name? Pearl suddenly asked. I don't recall introducing myself. Your luggage tag, Ethan explained. Pearl Scott from Boston, Massachusetts. There was something in his expression, a curiosity perhaps, that made Pearl feel the need to explain herself. My parents passed last winter. Influenza, she said quietly. Uncle Thomas is my only remaining family. He wrote that he could use a woman's touch around his ranch. His wife died years ago. Ethan nodded, understanding in his eyes. I'm sorry about your parents. Losing family is never easy. There was a story there, Pearl sensed, but she didn't press. Instead, she asked, were you always a cowboy? Not always, Ethan replied, taking her empty bowl. Served in the war when I was barely more than a boy. Afterward, couldn't settle back into town life. The open range suited me better. The war changed many things, Pearl agreed softly, thinking of the young men from Boston who had never returned. As night fell, Ethan added wood to the stove and lit a second lantern. You should rest, he advised, checking her bandage once more. The bleeding stopped, but you need to give your body time to heal. He returned to the chair beside her bed, opening a book. You don't have to stay right there, Pearl protested. I'll be fine. Ethan looked up, his expression unreadable in the lamplight. I'll be here if you need anything, he said simply, and returned to his reading. Pearl watched him for a moment before allowing her eyes to close, oddly comforted by his presence. The days that followed fell into a gentle rhythm. Ethan would rise at dawn, check on Pearl, then step outside to tend to his horse in the small garden patch behind the cabin. He'd return to prepare breakfast, change Pearl's bandage, and help her with whatever she needed. Though weak at first, Pearl gained strength each day. By the 5th day, she could sit up for longer periods, and Ethan brought her books from his small collection poetry by Whitman, adventure tales by Twain. Even a worn copy of Pride and Prejudice that he admitted with some embarrassment was his favorite. "My mother loved that book," he explained when Pearl expressed surprise. "She taught me to read from it, said a man who understood Elizabeth Bennet would understand women." "And do you?" Pearl asked, a teasing note in her voice. "Understand women?" Ethan laughed, a rich sound that Pearl realized she hadn't heard before. "Not in the slightest, but I appreciate the story all the same." On the 7th day, Pearl insisted on getting out of bed. Ethan helped her to the table where she sat while he prepared a rabbit stew for their dinner. "Tell me about your life in Boston," he said as they ate. Pearl described her childhood in a well-to-do merchant family, her education at a ladies' seminary, and the expectations that had surrounded her to make a good match, to be an ornament to society. "After my parents died, none of it seemed to matter anymore," she confessed. "The endless rounds of calls and teas, the gossip, the posturing, I wanted something real." Ethan nodded, understanding in his eyes. "The West isn't always kind, but it's always real. No room for pretense when you're facing drought or blizzard." "What about you?" Pearl asked. "You know so much about me now, but you've shared very little about yourself." Ethan was quiet for a moment. "Not much to tell. Grew up in Missouri. Father was a blacksmith. Joined up with the Union Army in '64 when I was 18. After the war, drifted west. Been working cattle ever since." "No family," Pearl pressed gently. A shadow crossed Ethan's face. "Lost my parents to a fever when I was 19. Had a brother, younger by 2 years. He didn't make it through the war." "I'm sorry," Pearl said softly. Ethan shrugged, but his eyes betrayed his lingering grief. "It was a long time ago." That night, as Pearl lay in bed listening to the coyotes howl in the distance, she found herself watching Ethan. He had fallen asleep in the chair beside her bed, his book open on his lap, head tilted at an angle that would surely leave his neck aching come morning. In repose, the hard lines of his face softened, making him look younger, more vulnerable. Pearl realized with a start that she had come to care for this quiet, thoughtful man. His steady presence, his unwavering care, his unexpected depth all had combined to create feelings she hadn't anticipated. The thought of leaving for her uncle's ranch, of never seeing Ethan again, left an unexpected hollow feeling in her chest. On the 10th day, Ethan returned from checking his horse to find Pearl standing at the stove, stirring a pot of coffee. She had managed to dress herself in one of her simpler traveling gowns, though she'd left it loosely laced to avoid pressure on her healing wound. "Should you be up?" he asked, concern evident in his voice. Pearl turned, a small smile on her lips. "I'm feeling much better. And I thought it was time I stopped being such a burden." "You're not a burden," Ethan said quickly, moving to stand beside her. He was close enough that Pearl could smell the clean scent of soap and pine that seemed to cling to him. "Nevertheless, I can't expect you to wait on me forever," she replied, trying to ignore the quickening of her pulse at his proximity. Ethan took the coffee pot from her hands, his fingers brushing hers in the process. "I don't mind," he said, his voice low. Their eyes met, and for a moment Pearl thought he might say more, might acknowledge the growing connection between them. Instead, he cleared his throat and stepped back. "Your uncle sent word," he said, turning to pour the coffee. "He'll be arriving tomorrow to take you to his ranch." "Oh," Pearl said, unable to hide her disappointment. "So soon?" Ethan nodded, his back still to her. "It's for the best. You need proper recovery time with a real doctor nearby, and I should get back to my duties at the ranch." Pearl wanted to argue, to say that she was recovering just fine under his care, but she knew he was right. She couldn't stay in his cabin indefinitely, no matter how much the thought of leaving pained her. "Of course," she said instead, forcing brightness into her voice. "I've imposed on your hospitality far too long already." That evening, their conversation was stilted, filled with long silences. Ethan seemed distant, as if he was already preparing himself for her departure. After dinner, he helped her back to bed, his touch as gentle as always but somehow more reserved. "Ethan," Pearl said as he turned to go back to his chair. Thank you for everything." He paused, then nodded without looking back at her. "Get some rest, Miss Scott. Tomorrow will be a long day." Pearl lay awake long into the night, watching as Ethan dozed fitfully in the chair beside her bed, as he had every night since bringing her to his cabin. She would miss this, she realized. Miss him. The morning dawned clear and crisp. Pearl packed her few belongings that had survived the stagecoach attack, moving slowly to accommodate her still healing wound. Ethan was oddly formal, calling her Miss Scott again after days of using her given name. They were just finishing a simple breakfast when the sound of approaching hoofbeats made them both look toward the door. Ethan rose, hand instinctively moving to his holstered revolver before relaxing. "That'll be your uncle," he said, moving to open the door. Pearl felt a strange reluctance to follow, to meet the relative who would take her away from this place, from Ethan. But she stood, smoothing her dress, and walked to the door. Outside, a wagon was pulling up, driven by an older man with a silver-streaked beard. He jumped down with surprising agility for his age and approached the cabin. "Uncle Thomas," Pearl called, stepping onto the small porch. The man looked up, relief washing over his weathered face. "Pearl, thank God you're all right." "When I got word about the attack," he broke off, rushing forward to embrace her carefully. "Are you truly well?" "I am, thanks to Mr. Forrester," Pearl said, stepping back to indicate Ethan, who stood a respectful distance away. Thomas Scott turned to Ethan, extending his hand. "I can't thank you enough for saving my niece, Mr. Forrester. Your letter was a godsend when we'd feared the worst." Ethan shook his hand briefly. "Just did what anyone would do, sir." "Nonsense," Thomas replied. "You're a hero, plain and simple." "Pearl is all the family I have left in this world." As the two men talked, Pearl found herself studying her uncle. He seemed kind, his eyes crinkling at the corners when he smiled, his manner open and friendly. Yet she felt no connection to him, this relative she barely remembered from childhood visits. "We should get going," Thomas said finally, turning back to Pearl. "It's a few hours' ride to the ranch, and I'd like to get you settled before nightfall." Pearl nodded, though her heart wasn't in it. "Of course, Uncle." Ethan helped load her small bag into the wagon, then stood awkwardly as Thomas climbed up to take the reins. "Well, Miss Scott," Ethan said formally, "I wish you all the best in your new life out west." Pearl felt tears threatening to form. Was this it? After all they'd shared, was he simply going to let her go with nothing more than polite well wishes? "Thank you again, Mr. Forrester," she replied, matching his formality, though it pained her to do so. Ethan helped her up to the wagon seat, his hands strong and sure at her waist. For just a moment, as she settled beside her uncle, their eyes met, and Pearl thought she saw regret in Ethan's blue gaze. But he stepped back, touching the brim of his hat in farewell. "Take care of her wound," he instructed Thomas. "It's healing well, but she shouldn't exert herself for at least another week." Thomas nodded. "I'll see she's looked after." With that, he flicked the reins, and the wagon began to move. Pearl twisted in her seat, watching as Ethan grew smaller in the distance, a solitary figure standing before the cabin that had been her sanctuary. "He seems a fine man," Thomas remarked as they followed the winding trail through the hills. "He is," Pearl agreed softly. Her uncle glanced at her, something knowing in his expression. "Saved your life at risk to his own, from what I gather," Pearl nodded, unable to trust her voice. "And cared for you all these days," Thomas continued. "Never left your side, according to what folks are saying in town." "He was very kind," Pearl managed. Thomas was quiet for a long moment, then said, "You know, Pearl, I've lived out west for 30 years now. One thing I've learned is that life's too short for regrets. If there's something you need to say to someone, you'd best say it before it's too late." Pearl looked at her uncle in surprise. "What do you mean?" Thomas smiled gently. "I mean that my ranch isn't going anywhere. It'll still be there tomorrow or the next day or even next week." He pulled the wagon to a stop. "If you've got unfinished business back there," he nodded toward the now distant cabin, "maybe you ought to finish it." Pearl's heart raced. "Uncle Thomas, go on," he encouraged. "I'll wait here." Without further hesitation, Pearl climbed down from the wagon, ignoring the twinge in her side. "Thank you," she said. squeezing her uncle's hand before gathering her skirts and starting back down the trail. She walked as quickly as her healing body would allow, her mind racing with all the things she wanted to say to Ethan. The sun climbed higher in the sky as she made her way back, and she was breathless by the time the cabin came into view. Ethan was outside, saddling his horse. He looked up at the sound of her approach, disbelief crossing his features. "Pearl, what are you doing here? Are you all right?" She stopped a few feet from him, suddenly uncertain. "I couldn't leave," she said simply. "Not without telling you." Ethan took a step toward her, hope flickering in his eyes. "Telling me what?" Pearl took a deep breath. "These past days, getting to know you, I've felt something I never expected to find out here, something I hope you might feel too." Ethan closed the distance between them, his hand coming up to gently touch her cheek. "I do," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "God help me, I do. I've been falling in love with you since the moment you opened your eyes in my cabin, but I had no right to speak of it. You have a new life waiting, a respectable life with your family. What could I offer you compared to that?" Pearl leaned into his touch. "You saved my life, Ethan. But more than that, you showed me what kind of man you are: honorable, gentle, strong. That's worth more to me than any respectable position." She smiled up at him. "Besides, my uncle seems to think quite highly of you." Confusion crossed Ethan's face. "Your uncle, where is he?" "Waiting down the trail," Pearl admitted. "He's the one who encouraged me to come back." Ethan laughed, the sound full of surprised joy. "I think I like your uncle already." His expression grew serious as he looked into her eyes. "Pearl, I don't have much. Just my wages from the ranch, this cabin, my horse. But if you'd be willing to build a life with me, I promise I'd spend every day trying to be worthy of you." In answer, Pearl rose on tiptoes, pressing her lips gently to his. Ethan's arms came around her carefully, mindful of her wound, as he returned the kiss with a tenderness that made her heart soar. When they finally broke apart, both breathless, Ethan pressed his forehead to hers. "I should probably talk to your uncle," he said with a smile. "Do this properly." "I think that's a fine idea," Pearl agreed. "He's waiting to meet the man who won his niece's heart by sleeping in a chair beside her bed until she opened her eyes." 3 months later, Pearl stood before a small gathering of people in the town's modest church, her hand held firmly in Ethan's as they exchanged their vows. Her Uncle Thomas beamed from the front pew, while Ethan's friends from the Diamond K Ranch filled the other seats. The ranch owner had offered Ethan a promotion to foreman and the use of a small house on the property, a wedding gift, he'd called it. Pearl had spent the past weeks turning the simple structure into a home, hanging curtains, planting flowers, and filling the shelves with books. "I now pronounce you man and wife," the preacher declared, and Ethan swept Pearl into a kiss that brought cheers from the assembled guests. Later, at the small celebration at their new home, Uncle Thomas raised a glass in toast. "To Pearl and Ethan, who remind us all that love can be found in the most unexpected circumstances." As the party continued around them, Ethan drew Pearl aside for a moment of privacy on the porch. "Happy, Mrs. Forrester?" he asked, his arms encircling her waist. Pearl leaned against him, watching the sunset paint the western sky in brilliant hues of gold and crimson. "Happier than I ever dreamed possible," she replied honestly. "Sometimes I still can't believe you came back that day," Ethan said, pressing a kiss to her temple. "That you chose this life, chose me." Pearl turned in his arms to face him. "It wasn't a choice at all, really. My heart knew where it belonged the moment I opened my eyes and saw you watching over me." She reached up to trace the line of his jaw. "I'm exactly where I'm meant to be." As darkness fell over the ranch, stars appearing one by one in the vast Arizona sky, Ethan and Pearl rejoined their guests, their hands intertwined, their future stretching before them as wide and promising as the western frontier itself. 5 years later, Pearl sat on the porch of their expanded home, watching as Ethan taught their 4-year-old son Thomas to ride his first pony. Their 2-year-old daughter Elizabeth played at Pearl's feet, arranging wildflowers in patterns only she understood. The Diamond K Ranch had prospered under Ethan's management, and they had prospered with it. Uncle Thomas, now in his 70s but still spry, had moved into a small cabin on their property the previous year, claiming he wanted to be close to his great-niece and nephew as they grew. As the sun began to set, Ethan lifted Thomas from the pony and set him on his shoulders, heading toward the house. Pearl's heart swelled with love at the sight of them, her handsome cowboy and their son who looked so much like him. "Mama," Thomas called excitedly, "did you see me riding?" "I did," Pearl confirmed as they reached the porch. "You're becoming quite the horseman." Ethan set the boy down and leaned over to kiss Pearl. "Just like his father," he said with a wink. Later, after the children were asleep and Uncle Thomas had retired to his cabin, Pearl and Ethan sat together on the porch swing, her head resting on his shoulder as they gazed at the star-filled sky. "You ever miss Boston?" Ethan asked, a question he hadn't posed in years. Pearl considered it honestly before shaking her head. "Not for a moment. Everything I love is right here." She took his hand, lacing their fingers together. "Though I do think Elizabeth might have your mother's love of literature. I found her with your copy of Pride and Prejudice today." Ethan laughed. "She's two." She was very carefully turning the pages, Pearl insisted, looking at them as if she understood every word. "God help us if she has your intelligence and my stubbornness," Ethan groaned good-naturedly. They fell silent, content in each other's company as the night deepened around them. Pearl thought back to that fateful day when bandits had attacked her stagecoach, how terrified she had been, how certain that her life might end before it had truly begun. Instead, that day had marked the true beginning of her life. The bullet that had struck her had led her to Ethan, to this home, to their children, to a happiness more profound than anything she could have imagined in her previous existence. "What are you thinking about?" Ethan asked, noticing her thoughtful expression. "Just how fortunate I am," Pearl replied, leaning up to kiss him softly. "How one moment can change everything." Ethan's arms tightened around her. "The luckiest day of my life was when you opened your eyes in that cabin," he murmured. "Even if my neck ached for a week afterward from sleeping in that damn chair," Pearl laughed, the sound carrying into the quiet night. "My heroic cowboy," she teased, "I think you deserve a more comfortable place to sleep tonight. Is that so?" Ethan replied, his voice dropping to a whisper as he stood, pulling her to her feet. Hand in hand, they walked into the house they had built together. Toward the future they continued to create with each passing day in this wild, beautiful land they both called home.